I remember that night as vividly as if it just happened. The clock had struck 11:45 p.m. The baby had been restless all evening, crying intermittently, and no amount of rocking or soothing seemed to help. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he fell asleep in his crib. I turned on the baby monitor, double-checked the locks on the windows and doors, and made my way to the kitchen to grab a cup of tea, thinking the worst of the night was behind me. As I poured the steaming water into the mug, a faint noise crackled through the baby monitor. It was soft at first, like static, and then I heard it. A low, rhythmic humming. My heart froze. I hadn't left anything in the room that could make that sound. For a moment, I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the baby's mobile had somehow turned on by itself. I hesitated, my gut telling me something was wrong. Gripping the counter for support, I strained my ears to listen. The humming stopped abruptly, and what followed was worse. Absolute silence. No static, no sound. Not even the baby's breathing. I bolted back to the nursery, my pulse hammering in my ears. The crib was empty. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but no. The blankets were thrown to the side, and the baby was gone. Panic surged through me as I scanned the room, checking under the crib, inside the closet, and even behind the curtains. Nothing. The doors were locked, the windows sealed shut. There was no possible way someone could have come in or out, and yet, the baby was gone. Desperate, I grabbed my phone to call the parents, but as I unlocked it, the screen flickered with static before the device went completely dead. My knees buckled as I stared at the baby monitor still clutched in my hand. The screen, now alive with fuzzy black and white noise, showed the crib, empty, but then the image shifted. Slowly, the camera panned on its own, moving toward the rocking chair in the corner of the room. My breath hitched. The chair was rocking gently, as if someone had just stood up from it. But the room was empty, or so I thought. I don't know what possessed me to approach the chair, but I did. Every step felt like walking through molasses. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. As I reached out to stop the chair from moving, the baby monitor let out a high-pitched squeal, and the screen turned black. That's when I heard it. A soft, gurgling coo that sent chills racing down my spine. It wasn't coming from the chair. It was behind me. I spun around, expecting, I don't know what. A shadow? A figure? But there was nothing there. The sound had vanished as quickly as it had come. My mind raced, searching for answers for logic, but there was none. And then I noticed it. Tiny footprints on the floor, leading out of the nursery and down the hall. They weren't human. Too small to belong to the baby, too misshapen to be anything familiar. They glistened faintly, as though wet, and disappeared around the corner. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed them. The footprints led to the living room. The lights flickered as I entered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. In the center of the room stood a tall, antique mirror I hadn't noticed earlier. It wasn't there when I arrived. My reflection looked back at me, but something was off. The room in the mirror wasn't the one I was standing in. The crib was there, and so was the baby, sitting upright and staring at me through the glass. His eyes were wrong. Too wide, too dark, and filled with an expression I can only describe as knowing. He raised a tiny hand and pointed at something behind me. I turned, every muscle in my body taut with dread. The living room was empty, but the air was alive with whispers, faint and unintelligible. The mirror's surface rippled like water. My distorted, terrified reflection smiled back at me before stepping forward out of the glass. It reached for me with hands that weren't mine, and I screamed. The last thing I remember was the sound of the baby's laughter, echoing through the house as everything went dark. When I woke up, I was outside, lying on the front lawn. The parents were shaking me awake, their faces pale and frantic. They demanded to know where their baby was. I turned toward the house, but the windows were dark, and the front door hung open, creaking softly in the wind. I had no answers for them. My throat felt dry, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried to speak. Every word felt like an apology, but no explanation came. The parents' desperate cries echoed in my ears as I stood there, frozen in helplessness. To this day, I'm haunted by that night, by the sound of that laughter and the image of those eyes. The baby was never found. I tried to make sense of it, to tell myself it was some sort of elaborate nightmare, but I knew better. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear that same gurgling coo, faint and distant, like a ghostly echo from the past. The memory refuses to fade, and the fear lingers, an ever-present shadow in my life. The house remains vacant. The parents moved away, unable to bear the weight of their loss, but the whispers haven't stopped. Neighbors claim to hear strange noises coming from the property, soft laughter, the creak of a rocking chair, and that haunting rhythmic humming. I've stayed away, too terrified to return, but deep down, I know it's not over. The house, the mirror, the baby, whatever took him, it's waiting. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I feel its presence, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike again. It started like any other quiet evening. I was babysitting for the Johnsons, a routine job I'd done countless times. Their house, a pristine suburban home, always felt peaceful. But that night something was different. As the clock ticked toward midnight, a subtle unease began creeping in. That feeling when the air in the room feels just wrong. That's how it was. I had just put the baby to sleep and was tidying up the living room. The sound of soft toys clinking together as I dropped them into the basket echoed more than usual in the stillness. Then it happened. I glanced at the large mirror across the room and froze. My reflection was there, normal, mundane, but standing behind me, there was someone else. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of light, it was a person, a man. He was staring at me, his face blurred like static on an old TV. My heart stopped. I couldn't move. My mind screamed to turn around to see if he was really there, and when I did, my blood ran cold. There was no one. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. It's late, I thought. I'm just tired. But as I turned back to the mirror, my reflection was alone again. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. Something felt off in the room, like I wasn't really alone. I started making excuses. Maybe it was the stress of the day, the eerie silence of the house. I even blamed the dim lighting, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen. My hands trembled as I went to grab my phone. I needed a distraction, a connection to someone outside this house. But the battery was dead. A cruel coincidence, or maybe something worse. Deciding not to dwell on it, I tried to focus on cleaning. Yet every little creak of the house sent chills down my spine. My eyes kept darting back to the mirror, almost involuntarily, expecting, no, dreading, to see him again. And then came the softest sound, a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Turn around." I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice wasn't loud, but it was there, unmistakable, just behind me. My pulse pounded in my ears. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself, louder than intended, as if saying it would somehow break the spell. I spun around quicker this time, desperate to catch whatever or whoever was there. The room was completely empty, but as my eyes scanned the area, they landed on something I hadn't noticed before. On the floor by the edge of the toy basket was a single footprint. A wet, muddy print. The windows were locked, the doors were bolted. I hadn't been outside all evening. That's when it hit me. Whoever, or whatever, was in here hadn't just been watching me, they'd been walking around. Panic set in. I grabbed a kitchen knife, clutching it so tightly my knuckles turned white. I needed to check on the baby. My legs felt like lead as I made my way upstairs, each step creaking under my weight. My breaths were shallow, my mind racing with possibilities. When I reached the baby's room, I pushed the door open with trembling fingers. She was there, safe, sound asleep in her crib. But then I noticed something odd. The baby monitor on the dresser was off. I didn't turn it off. As I reached to switch it back on, I saw it. A faint handprint on the crib rail, too large to be the baby's, too fresh to be old. My stomach churned. I backed away slowly, only to hear that faint whisper again. "You can't leave." I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. My first instinct was to run, but something stopped me. The mirror at the end of the hallway. Its surface was dark, almost cloudy, as if it were alive. I approached it cautiously, knife in hand, barely breathing. The reflection wasn't mine this time. It was him, the same blurred face, now grinning, his head tilted unnaturally to the side. He raised a hand, slowly pointing at me. I screamed and swung the knife at the glass, but it didn't break. Instead, the mirror rippled like water, distorting the man's image. He leaned closer, his voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "You let me in." I don't remember running out of the house. I don't remember calling the police. All I know is, when they arrived, everything was normal. No footprints, no handprints, no broken mirror. It was as if nothing had happened. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I quit babysitting after that night. I avoided mirrors for weeks. Yet, even now, I feel like he's still watching me. Sometimes when I glance at my reflection, I catch a flicker of movement behind me. People tell me it's all in my head. Maybe they're right. Or maybe he's waiting for the right moment to come back. Have you ever felt like someone was watching you? Maybe it was just your imagination. Or maybe, like me, you caught a glimpse of something you weren't supposed to see. If you ever find yourself alone, staring into a mirror, ask yourself, what's really standing behind you? It started with a single, unexplainable moment. I had just settled on the couch, the glow of the TV lighting up the darkened room. The Smiths had left me in charge of their 2 young kids for the night. The house was quiet. The kids were sound asleep upstairs. As I scrolled through my phone, I felt it. A sharp tug on my hair. Not just a light brush or a gentle pull, but a firm yank, like someone was trying to get my attention. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, expecting to see one of the kids playing a prank. But there was no one. Just the dimly lit living room and the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I laughed it off nervously, convincing myself it was my imagination or maybe the way I had leaned against the couch cushion. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The minutes ticked by and the house grew eerily still, too still. I'm not sure what made me notice it at first, but the usual creaks and groans of an old house seemed to stop altogether. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it. A faint giggle. It was soft, almost melodic, but unmistakably close. My stomach turned as I realized it didn't come from upstairs where the kids were sleeping. It came from right behind me. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. Slowly, I turned, scanning the room. Nothing. No one. The TV flickered, the volume dropping on its own. A cold draft swept through the room, and I swear I could feel someone standing behind me, even though I couldn't see them. By now, my nerves were shot. I decided to check on the kids, convincing myself it would calm my racing thoughts. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed the hallway seemed darker than before. The dim nightlight near the kids' rooms flickered as if struggling to stay on. I opened the door to the youngest child's room, and relief washed over me when I saw him peacefully asleep. But as I turned to check on his sister, I noticed something. A shadow that stretched across the wall, distinctly human-shaped, even though there was no one in the room to cast it. My breath caught in my throat. I backed out of the room slowly, heart pounding. I nearly stumbled down the stairs in my haste to return to the safety of the lit living room. Back on the couch, I tried to calm myself, clutching a blanket tightly around me. But the moment I sat down, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a giggle. It was whispering. Low, hushed voices, overlapping each other, too soft to make out the words, but loud enough to send chills down my spine. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Who's there?" I managed to croak, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the room into an oppressive silence. And then came the worst sound of all, the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the stairs, slowly, deliberately, coming closer. I bolted to the front door, my only thought being to get out of the house, but when I reached it, I found it wouldn't budge. The lock turned, the knob twisted, but the door remained firmly shut, as if something unseen was holding it in place. Panic set in. I turned toward the window to scream for help and saw it. A face, pale, expressionless, pressed against the glass. Its hollow eyes seemed to stare right through me, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table and landing hard on the floor. When I looked back at the window, the face was gone. The room was empty again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Desperation drove me back upstairs. I had to check on the kids. Bursting into the girl's room, I found her bed empty. The sheets were thrown back as if she had left in a hurry. My heart pounded as I searched the room, calling her name. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. My eyes darted toward the closet door. It was ajar, and the tapping was coming from inside. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept toward the door and flung it open. There she was, sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring up at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She smiled and said, "He's here. He wants to meet you." Before I could respond, the closet door slammed shut with a force that shook the room. The light flickered violently, plunging me into darkness. I pounded on the door, screaming her name, but there was no response. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling the room with their terrifying chorus. And then, just as abruptly as it began, everything stopped. The light came back on, the door creaked open, and the room was empty. Both kids were gone. The police never found them, and I could never explain what happened that night. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel it. That sharp tug on my hair, as if someone or something is reminding me that it's not over.